welcome everybody. We have Professor Josie Matthews with us today for the R&D seminar organized by the HR Area Initiative. Professor Josie Matthews has been working with Professor Vasanthi Srinivasan, who is my guide and Aditya's teacher also. And we have connected with each other quite a bit initially when they were doing some research on HRM in emerging economies. Recently, he had published a paper on paradoxes and tensions in HRM in the rapidly growing firms in project organizations, and that has been his field of work. Paradoxes and tensions in HRM are a very fertile field of HRM research. And what he is looking at is different aspects of paradoxes and tensions in HRM in different fields, like rapidly growing firms, project management firms, and emerging sector firms. So I thought it would be a great idea to have an interaction, formal presentation, where he will be presenting his paper on it's a published paper in HRMJ, and also he will talk about his further projects and research. After this seminar, we will also have an informal interaction with lunch.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am very delighted to be with some of the best professionals in the world in the area of HR, and in one of the best business schools of the world in the area of human resource management. I do thank you for your time, and I believe that we will have a meaningful interaction. As we all know, see, this is a conversation, so feel free to interrupt me at any point of time, and let's have a meaningful dialogue. As Rajesh said, this is on coping with human resource management paradoxical tensions in project-based organizations. Based on a paper we recently published a few months ago in Human Resource Management Journal. See, why we adopted the framework of paradox, and perhaps you might have seen, I have framed it not managing human resource management tensions, but coping with human resource management paradoxical tensions. For quite a long, research in the area has used positivistic frameworks, and the simplistic assumption was that there are HRM issues which can be permanently resolved. Therefore, there are theories which should be taught to students, and they can be applicable anywhere, without reference to context, and perhaps with the assumption that issues can be resolved. There is an increasing understanding today that organizations are much more complex than we can think of. Therefore, perhaps the assumption that issues can be managed and can be ironed out, perhaps may not exist. Therefore, the role for manager and the relevance for manager is that many of these issues are there, they can be coped with. When you cope with these tensions, this will reappear as some other kind of issues which need to be managed. Therefore, these ongoing tensions which managers and people really experience is the theme of the paper. Even academics who have worked on this area have argued that if you are not able to spot paradoxes in organizations, you have been looked enough. Therefore, we are looking at, it is not an esoteric theory as perhaps the term paradoxes would at the first place indicate. These are all issues which we all grapple with. Sometimes we close our eyes to and we don't recognize. So I don't want to go through the definition, but these are some of the standard definitions that is being used. So they are maybe consistent in isolation, but conflicting, incompatible, or contradictory when they are put together. All organizations face that, and in particular, we looked at this in the context of a software services way. Perhaps those of us who understand HRM really well know that HRM is generally contextualized in the context of very stable organizations like the L&Ds of the world, like the Mahindra and Mahindras of the world, which have got a business strategy and an HR strategy which is consistently shared across the organization. There is increasing realization now in different pockets of the same organization, in different units of the same organization, there are different sets of HRM practices. Some of them work in harmony with the central HR policies, some of them not so consistently, not so consistent with the central or corporate HRM philosophies and policies. Therefore, the assumption till now was that there is a business strategy and there is an HR strategy which is both vertically aligned as well as horizontally aligned. A number of academics have questioned this, and perhaps we are actually coming from this stream of thought. If you take, I use PBO, project-based organizations, short form PBO is indicate project-based organizations. If you particularly take project-based organizations, they are increasingly becoming significant. They command a sizable share of the economy, and they have obviously two distinct operating levels. One is the project level, other is the corporate level. And we have observed that there is a lot of heterogeneity within the same organization, primarily because a lot of HRM responsibility is devolved to project managers who have started increasingly taking up HR responsibilities. And project managers have got different HRM capabilities. We know many of them are generally trained to be managers, but a lot of them have got their base from their technical competence. Therefore, there is varied HRM capabilities for the project managers. And another increasing realization is that clients exert a lot of pressure on HRM. This is an ever increasing recognition that it is not the inside, it is not the internal stakeholders, but even external stakeholders have got a major influence on human resource management practices, and we actually test this out in this particular context. And obviously, since it's an exploratory research, single case, and we used 4 embedded case within the same organization to control for the environment. To find out the differences in projects, we started by asking managers, especially the senior managers, as to what is a meaningful way of comparing and contrasting projects. So when we asked them, they said a meaningful way in the context of software services industry is to take gross margin and potential for growth. That is perhaps some of the parameters which they adopt when customers come to them to see whether they will take up a project. These are the criteria which the top management generally employs. Okay. Therefore, we made a 2x2 matrix of gross margin and potential for long-term growth. So we divided them into 2 categories: high, high. 4 categories: high, high, low, 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 high, high, low. So we identified 4 projects based on that. See, in fact, I would quickly go through this because it is not the objective to talk about HRM heterogeneity in one and the same organization, which has been already established by earlier research. So, for example, we looked at 6 different HRM practices, and we identified, you can see the differences which are presented in the table, to perhaps to make the differences sharp when we come to performance management. So in DI projects, there are bi-monthly reviews with feedback. In Technostar, daily and weekly reviews with feedback at individual and team level using quantitative metrics, including metrics for knowledge sharing. Underperformers are put under watch, given feedback and immediately moved out. Whereas in Elegant, which is a long-term developmental project, there is only weekly review with feedback. And in Stays and Stay, which is another developmental project, daily reviews and immediate feedback at team level. Underperformers are moved out immediately, instantly. This is in fact perhaps a project which was of national significance this particular firm took up. which had a lot of visibility. So I just used performance management just to highlight the differences can be as sharp as this. Can you believe that this kind of differences exist in one and the same organization? And if you look at other practices as well, the paper also is available in the public domain, so perhaps you can have a look at it. But I have highlighted, just showcase this to highlight the significant differences that can exist in intra-firm about HR. So when we looked at the practices, HR practices, we realized that if you look at high, the projects which was high on both growth and margin had a very strong commitment orientation, whereas a low project was very compliant. It generally followed the human resource management policies and practices which were laid down by the corporates. On the other hand, when the emphasis on gross margin was high and potential for growth was low, it generally followed a productivity orientation. When the emphasis on growth margin was low and potential for long-term growth was high, that project followed a collaborative orientation. So we have 4 distinct orientations in HRM in one and the same organization in 4 different projects.
Sorry, I'm outside the discipline, so pardon me for my ignorance. But I guess if you take project organizations, which these are project units, right?
Yeah.
Given the longevity and the objective which they have, these are bound to occur, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so are we saying that this is very contradictory within the organization? I'm just only clarifying for myself.
This is contradictory in the sense, see, when people move from one project to another project, for people it's a real tension and stress. In one project, even if you don't perform well, you will be given another chance, you will have a second chance, and then you can be moved to another project. In another project, you either perform well or you are instantly moved out. See, these are not people in different organizations, one and the same organization, people from the same talent pool are employed. And see, for example, in one organization, this is individual performance based pay. In one project, you are rewarded for staying long with the project. In another project, you are paid. There is a group bonus being paid. So it's for an insider, it's a lot of confusion.
Again, I'm clarifying for myself. When such boundary is being crossed from one project organization to another, let's say short term versus long term.
Yeah.
Those who are crossing the boundary or invited to cross would be one who has more suitable attributes for the other, right, by the HR selection. So will they experience that kind of contradiction?
They might see projects are of different duration, so people will invariably move from one project to another. So when they move from one project to another, they experience quite a lot of difference, and sometimes people have told us that it's much more than we can stand.
But in the transition, there will be some selection, right? Either a self-selection or a selection through a criteria in which people with certain attributes would be moving.
That is true, but if you look at from the organization's perspective, see, you need knowledge sharing. You need, in the long term, if you look at the projects, organizations would like to develop level of competence. Organizations would like people to develop different capabilities working on a set of projects. So when projects are inherently different, it actually comes in the way, number one. It also comes in the way of organizational integration, which in fact is very vital for organizations to move forward. And also, if you look in terms of the values and the culture of the organization, see, if different values are practiced in one and the same organization, see, different sets of performance assessment, different sets of practices for compensation also means that different values are being practiced in one and the same organization, sometimes pushed by the client and pushed by a number of other factors, that it leads to different values prevailing in one and the same organization, which is in fact inherently against the general theorization and against the understanding that organizations generally have a set of values which inform everything which organization does. It may not be as shattering for outside people, but perhaps, yeah.
The only reason why I asked is in our literature, it's very common to really presume that divisional differences exist and you discriminate.
Yeah.
The skills required, the longevity, the focal point. They are very different within an organization across divisions. For example, if you take an LNT, 9 ICs,
Yeah.
you know, hydrocarbon versus shipbuilding,
Yeah.
totally different kind of objectives could exist.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I worked with Heterogeneity. Maybe I can
Yeah.
allude to some of the stuff. So for example, you know, when he's talking about a client driving HR practices, so I've seen that example. So when Statue of Unity was being constructed, it was Prime Minister's office that was driving the entire thing. 15 months that it had to be done. So all the practices that typically prevail in the organization, and this I'm talking about L&T construction, all of that would go out of the window because suddenly you're constantly working against the timeline. So I think within the organization sometimes the movement happens because of skills and competencies. It's only when you come to that project you realize there are softer aspects, there are cultural aspects which perhaps the person might not feel comfortable with, and that's what perhaps is being discussed.
Thank you.
So one question you're going to answer, which was the next one, Smith and Lewis defining the different paradoxes. So how do you see that? The second thing I wanted to ask you was you talked about horizontal and vertical integration.
Yeah.
But to me it seems to be a three-dimensional problem. The third one being action.
Yeah.
So because it's the same organization, the policies won't really differ between project to project.
Yeah.
Right? The main HR policies. What we are talking about is how they are being implemented,
Yeah.
which differs. So actually what we are looking at is action is different dependent on the time horizon.
See, generally it should be practices which are very different. But when you talk about different kinds of reward systems, when you talk about different kinds of performance management systems, see, any practice, if you look at it, any practice comes against certain assumptions and values. And different sets of organizations have got different sets of values. So when you say practices are different, it also essentially implies that practices are stemming from certain assumptions and values. So in fact, inherently we are talking about the clash of values in the
No,
different.
but so you have one case, one organization with 4 different cases,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So for example, remuneration will not be different across the 4 project teams.
See, for
The
example.
way that performance management is done, they will have a cycle still.
Yeah.
But the manager, the project manager is deciding whether I do it daily, weekly, bi-weekly, quarterly, whatever.
So, for example, if you take the compensation management, assume that it is group bonus and not individual bonus. And many of these organizations, they have got variable pay as a huge percentage of their compensation. So, when you say it's group bonus as against individual bonus, that against the basic values which organization would like to profess generally. So technically it may not appear that philosophy is different, but if you look at the philosophical undertones of the practices being followed, there are differences.
Correct, but how much of that is attributed to the project manager?
How much of that?
How much of that can I attribute to the project manager?
You see, it can be attributed to the project manager, it can be attributed to the client, but in effect, if you look at it, the practices are different. For an employee who comes in, it's very different. It was individual performance based pay in one project, which was a sizable percentage of their compensation, whereas now it is group based rewards. So the differences can be very stark and may appear that only practices are different, but practices always have got a philosophical and value connotations from which they stem from. Okay, so from our analysis, we came up with a number of paradoxes related to the different HRM functions. For example, I have listed down here the different HRM practices, and for example, we have already discussed individual versus collective incentives. See, for example, when it comes to competence development, projects would like to develop short-term competencies, some of them for furthering the project needs, but organizations in the long run would like to have rounded professionals who work across platforms, who work across different kinds of projects that in fact leads to attention in the organization. Performance management, sometimes the client has, as we have already discussed, client has got their own parameters. However, organization would like to have its policies which are followed across the organization, for example. For example, with respect to knowledge transfer, organization would like people to have knowledge sharing on different areas and in a particular way.
This organization, did they allow lateral entry at senior levels?
Yeah, they allow.
Then why should they worry about long-term organizational learning? I mean, the lateral entry is allowed, so whenever they need senior people, they'll recruit from the market. That's the philosophy they are adopting, and that's where what he's saying. See, these are not the organizational policy issues. These are primarily the individual, the way they want to treat the people. You know, the project manager or their leadership styles are very, very different, and that's how they are treating the team members in their project very, very differently, which is getting reflected in the motivation and the energy of the team members. So that's precisely what seems to be happening here.
Yeah.
And that's where the short-term project needs, for example, you know, even the other matters like client satisfaction versus employee development. Again, organization may not have a policy, they simply say that you are the in charge of this project. But it's the project manager who takes a call that, you know, where will be my primary thrust. And that's just project to project, there are so big differences, and primarily it reflects the priorities or the values of the project manager, not that of an organization.
So if you look from the organizations, especially the software services industry, which has grown very rapidly, one of the key issues was that the industry grew very fast. So they wanted a lot of rounded professionals as middle-level managers, which they couldn't grow because because of a lot of issues happening, and they wanted senior people who will be homegrown. They can try to take laterally. Lateral taking people may not be always available, and also let us be aware that there is a lot of competition for the lateral hires, and sometimes it comes at a cost. So for an organization to grow, obviously you can take wherever there is shortages, you can take laterally, but it is not as straightforward as that we want this skill set and it is immediately available. It may not be available. I need X, Y, Z and B competencies, people may not be available. So in the long run, the organization would like to develop people with a certain skill set, and developing middle level and senior level managers is a priority of the organization. However, when clients insist that people have to be trained, and when they pay bonuses, it's an indirect incentive for the people to stay back in the same organization. So actually, if you look at it from a long-term perspective, some of them may be ironed out by lateral hires, but it is not permanently addressed. And for organizations, they would like to homegrown managers who have got same set of values, who have got same set of vision, so that they can drive the growth in the direction they would like to go. So we identified a set of tensions which prevail there, and then very interestingly, perhaps we are aware that tensions exist. All of us acknowledge. However, how did this particular organization look at resolving these issues? When we analyzed the literature, we identified two sets of mechanisms. One is structural and relational. And perhaps some of us know it very well. However, in this framework of how do organizations cope with paradoxes and tensions, it may not have been exactly captured. So structural is lateral committees. See, for example, in this particular organization, there was a project manager training, a 1 year long project manager training, which people, if they need to become project managers, they need to undergo. There were a number of structural mechanisms which they put in place. On the other hand, there were also a lot of relational mechanisms. It may be organizational events, cultural festivals, even very simple things like celebrations, birthday parties, what I call joy events in which the team would go out. All these mechanisms which they introduced, so they help to a great extent in, if not resolving, at least coping with some of the stresses and paradoxes which the HRM systems throw up. See, for example, here in this table I am summarizing perhaps some of the paradoxical tensions and some ways in which these tensions will cope with. For example, if you look at the structural mechanisms, technical and other communities. For example, there is a Java community. Java community, people from all across the organization will come and they will enhance the knowledge. So, for example, if there is not a structured knowledge sharing and structured knowledge sharing systems do not work, the informal communities work. So it developed competencies. So like that, I have identified the paradoxical tensions for each one of them. For example, organizational identification versus client identification. This is a major issue. People are working for a particular organization, at the same time a number of times since they worked with clients, they identify themselves with the client because day in and day out they work with the client. So a number of events like socialization, even structural mechanisms like certifications, the imagery of a college campus itself, and values and senior management continuity, etc., help to cope with some of the tensions in this regard. Generic versus proprietary knowledge transfer. So obviously there were structural mechanisms. Independent of projects, there were opportunities to develop knowledge, and a number of many times the values of the organization, the senior management continuity, etc., help people to cope with some of the paradoxes. Client satisfaction versus employee development. So short-term project needs versus long-term organizational learning investment, the HRM centralization and human resource management information systems, the central systems in which people from across the world, even if they are on a client side, there were mechanisms and trainings and resources which they could actually make use of and could access. All these things help. Individual versus collective incentivization, a lot of relational mechanisms, the imagery of a college campus, the values, the HRM centralization, etc., help to cope with some of the tensions and paradoxes which they identified. Now, coming to theorization, let us look at the high growth quadrant projects. High growth quadrant projects generally employ relational rather than structural coping mechanisms. High growth projects involve innovation that necessitates significant level of collaboration and commitment, which are best supported by relational coping mechanisms. For example, the high growth low margin project had an individualized relational coping mechanisms to manage its highly skilled employees. High growth high margin project, to a lesser extent, it also had more relational mechanisms than structural coping mechanisms. So the developmental projects generally employed more relational coping mechanisms than structural coping mechanisms. When it comes to high margin, low growth projects, so for them it is less expensive. Therefore, they use less expensive structural coping mechanisms. The low margin, low growth project generally followed the corporate HR policies and philosophies. Therefore, it had relatively less tensions. They experienced little paradoxes. So therefore, if you look at this, coping mechanisms is carefully tailored to the stakeholder relationship and the nature of work within the project. When the work is innovative, when the work is developmental, they use generally more relational mechanisms are employed. When the work is not developmental, it is supportive, it's maintenance, structural mechanisms can be more meaningfully employed. So in this particular organization, they used a range of complementary, structural and relational coping mechanisms. Obviously, as we perhaps have realized by now, these do not resolve the HR paradoxes and tensions. However, they help the organization to cope with them. And although, despite all the huge investments made in training, all the huge investments made in HR, it had a comparable employee turnover, perhaps a little less than the industry average. Perhaps a number of times HR researchers make the high claims that if you follow particular HR policies, particular aspects of culture, it will bring down attrition, which in fact is not the case. Perhaps the imperative to move to a mixed set of projects and upscale the operations and high level of client involvement means that this kind of tensions are going to prevail in any organization which actually take up projects, clients and HR. This is another significant finding of the study. In fact, if you look at clients and if you look at the control literature, generally we use output control, process control or social control. And then a number of times academics, associated people argue that output control is HRM. No, it is not. HRM is not output control. HRM is about either either process control or social control. So when we talk in terms of managing human resources, we are actually, the area of output control is obviously not in the window of opportunity. Direct and output control projects, when project tasks are routine and can be readily monitored through quantitative metrics, as in this case the project of DRA and Technostar, output control was used. Intensity of the output control exercise by Technostar sometimes force project management to adjust Infotech HRM approach in more calculative way. So rather than collaborative kind of HR approach, it was more calculative kind of HR approach that was followed. Innovative projects. With respect to innovative projects, the output is more uncertain. It is not defined. Therefore, the direct control of the respective projects include, therefore, these projects use direct control of the respective projects, including project level HRM. For example, states and state, in this case, and the kind of selection and performance measurement they adopted. For example, if you take Elegant, they adopted social control through extensive socialization of project memories. That is because the project is much more developmental in nature, the work is imprecise, the work is innovative, therefore that is a meaningful way of doing that. Therefore, we actually extend Swart and Kenny's theorization to project-based organization, its nature, and extending what circumstances do clients tend to adopt particular forms of controls. States and State was an Indian organization that assumes cultural commonality with the project. Elegant was an MNC with extensive experience of cultural integration of foreign operations. Therefore, Elegant invested. They had a lot of experience in cultural development and development of cultural values. Therefore, they hugely invested in cultural development, which in fact we can say is a way human resource managers would like to deal with that. Cultural integration requires time, and unlike Elegant projects, States and State was relatively short time. Since it was short time, they couldn't actually invest so much in cultural development. So actually, if you look at this, if I can summarize, in the times to come, organizations have become complex. They are going to become more complex. And as Benny perhaps rightly pointed out, it's already in the finance sphere, in other areas it already exists, but there is an increasing awareness that HRM is not going to be uniform in the same organization. It is likely that there are likely to be different systems of HRM in different parts of the same organization, which makes the task of budding managers and researchers very complex. If you follow different kinds of HRM policies and practices in one and the same organization, since you want people to move across, you want people to develop same set of values, it will create a lot of paradoxes and tensions. These paradoxes and tensions there is no one-shot solution for these kinds of paradoxes and tensions. Therefore, they need to be constantly monitored. If you resolve one problem, that solution itself will generate another issue. That in fact is the beauty of using the paradox theory rather than positivistic frameworks, and in a world in which we are living in. Earlier, the assumption was that the internal stakeholders will dictate our policies increasingly, more than increase. So if you looking at it from a systems perspective, rather than internal stakeholders, a number of external stakeholders, especially clients, will have a decisive influence on HRM policies. Therefore, and the nature of the client, the control exercised by the client will differ. See, for example, if you look at many of the failures which resulted from the outsourcing, that some of them was attributed to the fact that clients did not work in partnership with the organization to whom they outsourced the work. You cannot say that, see, we have outsourced the work, whether it is the failure of brakes in Toyota or anything that happened in the world, corporate fiascos. See, you cannot say that you have outsourced to somebody else and there are legal terms which will actually make compensation for you, but your reputation is lost. So when you work with, partner with organizations from across the globe, when you cross the frontiers, organizations work in partnerships so that failures don't happen. So when clients come into the shop floor, they are coming not to say good mornings and sharing pleasantries. They are coming to ensure that work is done effectively and work is done productively. When they come in, it's likely that they will exercise control. And in fact, we are taking forward, this was a single case study with 4 embedded cases. Now we are exploring this in the case of a large professional software organization, and if possible we would like to do a quantitative study of project-based organizations. And with Rajesh we are exploring, we are doing already a study on human resource management tensions in rapidly growing fields, which are in fact, and we assume that these tensions will be much more prevalent and persistent in those organizations which grow very fast. And I hope it was meaningful, and I am open to any questions, and perhaps rather than asking questions, let's have a discussion on some points which touched you or some points in which you would like to take forward.
I have, so you had 2 different approaches that you saw, right? One was for organizations that are more revenue, or the projects that are basically based on margins, and one which is based on growth.
Yeah.
Why can't I convert it to ambidexterity? Exploration versus exploitation. To me it seems the same.
Yeah.
Right? So one, I'm exploring the growth and I'm exploiting where the margins are.
Yeah.
And there is a whole bunch of literature there where they talk about structuration and how do you deal with ambidexterity.
Yeah.
Structuration is one. That was one question. The other question was, if you are drawing from Wendy Smith's paper on paradoxical, there is a whole stream of literature which talks about how do you deal with paradoxical tensions. For example, do you do blending of practices?
Yeah.
Do you do hybridization? Do you do structuration?
Yeah.
Right? So, have you thought of those 2 approaches?
See, basically, we asked the top management team about how to distinguish projects here. Now, in the new project that we are doing with the large software services firm, we are asking project managers. And interestingly what they said, I had interviews in the last couple of days, they said, see, any project that comes to us we generally take, we don't turn customers away. But for us, a meaningful way of doing that is to look at time and material projects. Time and material project, if I put it very crudely, is almost equivalent to body shopping. So in time and material project, the client actually almost, if I use it very crudely, unacademic words, the client almost dictates HR practices. From end to end, the client decides how HR practices are. But if you take fixed price product, which is perhaps equivalent to developmental product, it is different. Client, there is a client influence, client working partnerships, etc. However, the client influence is little less. It is different in managed services. Therefore, it looks on what kind of, where do you come from the top management perspective, or where you come from the project manager's perspective. So the different approaches will vary. And obviously here we wanted, this was an exploratory study in that context, therefore we wanted to have a very grounded understanding of how these tensions are played out and how these tensions are coped with. Perhaps some of us who have been here, some of you might be thinking in your mind, what is new? For us, this existed. But for a number of leaders who never understood what was happening in the outsourced firms in India, which actually take up such huge volumes of work, and they have shown to international significance, but it has not been showcased as to how HRM is practiced in such kind of an organization. Therefore, I think it's interesting for a number of people who haven't done that. Obviously, the theoretical boundaries can be pushed. We can use, say, in the next paper, we would perhaps like to use a little more robust approaches in terms of whether it's blending, whether it is splitting, etc., etc. Thank you very much for the suggestion.
Sir, I had a slightly different question around employee resistance. When you say that there are these differentiated practices across the organization for different projects, how does it deal with resistance of employees? Because if I am in a project where the HRM practice and policy is very employee friendly, versus if I'm put in a project where it is not so,
Yeah.
it is stricter than it was in my previous project,
Yeah.
then how, of course I could resist. It could be with the project manager or with the client. So, in that situation, how does it deal with this resistance?
See, in this particular organization where we looked at, basically employees could not be forced. Therefore, they had a choice of doing that. Therefore, this is less in which people can move. And when people are not happy, they could actually move.
Since voluntarily they choose.
They could do a great extent. Although managers do a lot of persuasion, sometimes senior managers come in and do the persuasions, etc. To a great extent, there was an option. But in the current organization which we are studying now, there is not much of an option. Therefore, this kind of tensions are likely to be much more. See, if you look at software industry, if I don't have any data, I am not talking from research. If you look at general data on Googles of the world, see, it's about 30% attrition, which we all know for all practical purposes will be around 50%. Another 10-15% above what they accept. So look at an organization in which about 30 to 40% attrition happens. Look at an organization in which, see, if there are 300,000 people, 30% attrition means 90,000 people move out and 20-30,000 people move in. It's the size of, see, IBM over 100 years is a little above 100,000 employees, right? So it's a huge multinational which existed for over 100 years coming in. And another multinational, another organization which existed, so much people move out. What is the net movement? So when you talk about organizational growth is always driven by a set of values in which people think alike and people that vision forms the driving force behind growth. Therefore, I think it is going to be increasingly difficult in these organizations, and therefore it's likely to. That is why you see why your question is you got it very right, and you hit the nail at the point. That is why you see a lot of attrition, people moving out. Obviously, compensation may be one factor, but obviously the nature of projects they would like to work with is another factor. Yes.
So I have a question with respect to Smith and Lewis paper.
Yeah.
So in that paper itself, the author talks about the ways to deal with the specific tension. So
Yeah.
one of the ways, if I can recall properly, is adjustment strategy.
Yeah.
So that adjustment strategy, with respect to all these HRM system tensions that you have encountered, do you think that the strategies that are provided in such kind of managing of the paradoxical tensions, you can fit all these solutions that you have provided and you have got to know from these cases into those boxes?
See, basically, when you talk about these are abstractions of reality, right? Therefore, we can actually put some of this into different brackets and say this is splitting, this is adjusting, and this is postponing, etc. Yes, obviously, yeah. We can always put it. And coming back to the point which was earlier raised, exploitation versus exploration. Basically, if you look at software firms, rather than exploration, it's my thought. Please, you can actually come in and it's open for everybody to say. I am not an expert there, but my thought is that the many issues that we are facing is not actually an issue of exploration. The issue is about exploitation, isn't it? If you look at attrition, if you look at the scaling up, if you look at whether to buy or group talent, it's basically an issue of exploitation rather than exploration.
So that's why I was not able to understand how you are generalizing the findings. Let's say if you want to say that what organization should do in these cases in such paradoxical tensions. So like what kind of examples we can give out to the organization how to handle such paradoxical tensions.
So in this particular case, what we have used is we said clients influence HRM practices, HRM heterogeneity exists, lot of paradoxes are there. In this particular case, rather than going the theoretical abstraction or splitting, postponing, adjusting, etc., we thought an effective way of looking at this may be to look at structural and relational coping mechanisms. Actually, if you look at literature, this is a literature which perhaps is also going back to multinationals. Multinationals had this problem. So they had looked at integration mechanisms earlier as well. So perhaps we thought, rather than going into theoretical abstractions, a very meaningful and practical way of looking at this is to look at and stop here, leaving the rest of it for a paper or research we both can explore together and we can take to the next level.
From purely academic point of view, I'm curious. So the work by Beckham in 2019, the Science paper which talks about approaches already coexist in the organization, and we require the paradoxical mindset to take place. When, as you mentioned, is a project-based organization and different projects, different managers are existing. So, did you observe the paradoxical mindset? That's why these coping mechanisms, did they emerge, or is it more like need assessment that was done, that there will be probable tensions and then have been that coping mechanisms? Because because I personally met also to come in, and that was his take on the coping part to it. That he was in alignment with the fact that that strategies I just mentioned strategies. These strategies are just the patchwork. You need to understand the mindset first of the one who is leading the paradoxes, and then work on the coping part. So did you observe in that study?
This is a very beautiful thought. In fact, I was speaking to your dean, Rajesh. He was dean.
Alumni and
External affairs, and he was telling his area is operational research, and he is talking about new platforms which are developed. Some of them by the alumni of IIMA, which are in fact running into few hundred crores over a short span of time. If you look at this organization, see, I think these are some of the brilliant minds. And I think future belongs to all these people. And honestly, you could never believe. When we started this project, we went there to explore human resource management and how it's related to effectiveness. We wanted to do a case study. But when we spoke to the top management, we realized that they are some of the finest people you can ever speak to. They understood that these tensions existed. They understood that these paradoxes are there. And can you believe that many years ago, when about 15-20 years ago, when this paper was not written, obviously Smith and Lewis paper was a very old paper which came in Academy of Management. The top management knew this. They knew that this kind of paradoxes exist. That is why they put in place all these mechanisms. They didn't say about Smith and Lewis. They didn't talk about splitting. They didn't talk about postponing. They didn't talk in terms of suppressing. But they knew this. That is why, actually, if you look at this particular organization was set up by professionals who resigned from some of the top IT firms. And you know, the first thing which they did, they all came together. The founders came together to a place. And you know why? They didn't go in flights, because they were some of the best people the industry would fly. If 6 of them are going to a particular place, the media would smell rat. They took a car and they disguised themselves. I went to a remote place. The first thing they wrote was their mission and HR statement. I don't know if I go in further details, you will recognize the organization, but they said it is not. We are not going to talk in human resource management. We are not going to treat people as resources to be exploited, etc., etc. Therefore, it began with a vision, and they had this vision. And if you look at some of the best corporations which are growing now, and as your dean was speaking as well, these are some of the finest minds, and that is why it is predicted by long time. I don't know, it stands corrected. It was predicted that by 2042, the country with the highest GDP will be China, followed by US in the second place, India on the third place. Yes, people are aware of such kind of paradoxical issues which are happening, and they have, even before these issues cropped up, they set in place mechanisms which will actually resolve some of these issues. Yes, may not be exactly in HR jargons or management jargons as we say, but they are visionaries who are aware of this process. But a very beautiful thought, very fine-grained thought. I couldn't know how can you ask that question.
I may have missed it, I walked in a bit late, but when you're talking about emulating college campuses or like that as a strategy to handle paradoxes, so what exactly and how did that really help them manage these paradoxes or cope with them?
Many of the software organizations, when you look at it, the average age is 25-26. They are coming from the campuses. So there is a playground. You are very stressed. You can go out and play football. You are stressed. You can go out and there is a meeting room which are named after Einstein or Isaac Newton, etc. You can go. Or Ramanuja, a room named after Ramanuja. Or there is a eating place like a campus where you can go. And there are weekly outings in between. Once in a month they have got some activity called joy activities in which they can go. So when they go, and sometimes the top management also go, when they play football, see, when you play football, you are all equals, unfortunately, whether you like it or not. So then you really see a number of times conflicts escalate because there is no opportunity to speak about it. And you make your mind make a lot of guesses, etc. But when you actually speak out, you might think that many of these issues are very silly. See, for example, I remember one of the project leads suddenly died, and he had a wife who was illiterate in computers. They gave her a job, and they actually got her in, and they trained her, and she is one of the employees there. This kind of things which really happen become stories, and the stories are shared by people. When people share that story, see, all organizations say in their website, we are a caring, sharing, learning organization. That is one part of the story. But when you really experience it in some way or other, it is shared in your bathrooms, in your canteens, and people speak. When you go in the office, transport, etc. When they are informally shared, it becomes a binding force. See, for example, they used to actually display the pictures drawn by children with disabilities. Or now I think it is differently able to children, whatever. So when you do things like that and you don't explicitly speak about that, it actually speaks volumes about the kind of values that you follow, and that in fact becomes a much more binding force. Values is basically about unquestionable assumption, isn't it? So, for example, in the East, we have a custom. Anybody who is elder to us comes to our house, or when we are sitting, we wake up, we stand up and receive people, isn't it? Obviously, the value is respect. But where is this value coming from? Where is it coming from? What do you think? So the Eastern assumption is that anybody who is elder to us is part of God. That is the Eastern assumption. This assumption were told by parents to their children, to grandchildren, etc. Over many hundreds of years, this has been pushed from our level of conscious to the subconscious. If I ask 100,000 people, they will not be able to tell me why do they stand up. They will say respect. Why? Where is the respect coming from? People don't know. But even if it has been pushed from the level of conscious to subconscious, from the subconscious it is able to still drive behavior. So when values are imbibed by people, it in fact drives behavior. Often managers don't recognize that. They try to make small changes at the level of artifact. If you go by Sheets model and want to change an organization, it doesn't happen. But if you actually talk about values, which are the underlying assumptions, if you actually drive towards values which enable, uplift, give meaning to people, people will do anything to fulfill those things. That is the history of humanity, that is the history of business, isn't it? That has been a lot of time. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for your time, and thank you for some of the critical thoughts which will certainly inform in our future research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here and healthy and